Gabriel tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as he glanced at the gas gauge hovering dangerously close to empty. His old truck rattled as he drove down the empty stretch of highway, the weight of overdue bills and his daughter's growing needs pressing heavily on his chest. He needed a break, just one moment where things didn't feel like they were slipping through his fingers. Then he saw her. A woman stood on the side of the road, her thumb out, her long, dark hair whipping in the wind. She wasn't dressed like a typical hitchhiker. Her coat looked expensive, her boots pristine, but there was a desperation in her stance, an urgency in her eyes. Gabriel slowed down, debating for a split second before rolling to a stop beside her. "Need a ride?" he asked, leaning over to push open the passenger door. The woman hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, please." Her voice was rich, smooth, but there was an exhaustion behind it, like she'd been running from something. As she climbed in, Gabriel noticed the way she carefully folded her hands in her lap, her posture straight despite the obvious fatigue in her face. She smelled like roses and something else, something expensive. "I'm Gabriel," he said, pulling back onto the road. "Francesca," she replied, glancing at him briefly before looking out the window. He waited for her to offer more, but she didn't. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Anywhere but back there," she said, nodding toward the road behind them. Gabriel frowned but didn't press. He knew what it was like to want to leave something behind. They drove in silence for a while, the hum of the truck filling the space between them. Gabriel stole a few glances at her, wondering what someone like her was doing hitchhiking in the middle of nowhere. She looked out of place in his truck, like she belonged in a sleek black car with tinted windows, not in a vehicle that barely had working heat. "You live around here?" she asked suddenly. "Yeah," he said, exhaling. "A few towns over, got a daughter, Lily, she's 6. Francesca turned to look at him, her expression softening. 6 is a good age," Gabriel chuckled. "Yeah, when she's not trying to convince me, she should have ice cream for breakfast." A small smile played on Francesca's lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. They drove for another 20 minutes before Gabriel noticed her shivering. He reached into the back seat, grabbing the old flannel jacket he kept there. "Here," he said, handing it to her. Francesca hesitated but then took it, wrapping it around herself. "Thank you." Her fingers brushed his for a second, sending an unexpected warmth through him. Gabriel cleared his throat, gripping the wheel tighter. "You got family around here," she exhaled sharply. "Not the kind that matters." That told him everything he needed to know. The gas station sign up ahead was a welcome sight. Gabriel pulled in, parking near the pump. "I'm gonna fill up. You hungry?" Francesca hesitated. Gabriel didn't wait for her to answer. He climbed out, filling the tank before heading inside. He grabbed a couple of sandwiches, a bottle of water, and some snacks, then walked back to the truck. "Here," he said, handing her a sandwich. She blinked at him, surprised. "You didn't have to, just eat," he said, starting the truck again. Francesca unwrapped the sandwich carefully, like it was something delicate. She took a bite, chewing slowly. "This is good," she murmured. Gabriel chuckled. "It's a gas station sandwich, Francesca," she shrugged. "Still good." They drove for another hour, the tension slowly melting into something quieter, something almost comfortable. Then Gabriel's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, already dreading what he'd see. His boss's name flashed across the screen and his stomach sank. "Let me guess," Francesca said, watching him. "Bad news," Gabriel sighed. "Probably." He let the call go to voicemail, gripping the wheel tighter. Francesca studied him. "You're struggling." It wasn't a question. Gabriel let out a humorless chuckle. "That obvious." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a sleek black card. "Take this." Gabriel frowned. "What?" "My card," Francesca said simply. "If you ever need anything." He took it hesitantly, flipping it over. His heart nearly stopped when he read the name. Francesca DeLuca, CEO of DeLuca Enterprises. His stomach flipped. He looked at her, really looked at her, and suddenly everything made sense. The expensive coat, the way she carried herself, the way she hesitated before accepting kindness. She wasn't just anybody. She was a billionaire, and he had no idea what that meant for him. Gabriel kept his eyes on the road, but his grip on the wheel had tightened. The name on the card burned into his mind like a brand. The woman sitting beside him wasn't just a hitchhiker in need of a ride, she was Francesca DeLuca, a name he had seen splashed across financial magazines and news headlines. The CEO of DeLuca Enterprises, a company so massive it might as well have been its own country. And she was sitting in his battered truck, wrapped in his old flannel jacket. Silence stretched between them, thick and charged. Gabriel wasn't sure what to say. He could feel Francesca watching him, waiting for a reaction, but he wasn't the type to fall over himself for money or power. Still, it changed things. He wasn't sure how, but it did. "You don't have to look at me like that," she finally said. Gabriel didn't take his eyes off the road. "Like what?" "Like I just grew a second head," he exhaled sharply. "I just wasn't expecting to pick up a billionaire on the side of the road, that's all." Francesca shifted in her seat. "I wasn't expecting to be on the side of the road." That pulled his attention for a brief second. He glanced at her, noting the tension in her jaw. Whatever she was running from, it wasn't small. "Do I even want to know?" he asked. She let out a quiet breath. "Probably not." Gabriel could respect that. He had questions, but he wasn't the kind to pry. If she wanted to talk, she would. Until then, he'd keep driving. The gas station food had taken the edge off his hunger, but exhaustion was creeping in. It had been a long day, and the road stretched ahead endlessly. He needed to stop soon. "You got a plan?" he asked. Francesca hesitated. "I was going to figure that out as I went." Not the kind of answer he expected from someone used to having control over everything. He considered his options. Dropping her off at some roadside motel didn't sit right with him. She might have more money than he'd ever see in his lifetime, but that didn't mean she was safe. Not out here. "There's a diner a couple towns over," he said. "Has decent coffee. I can drop you there if you want." She studied him, her expression unreadable. "And then what?" he shrugged. "That's up to you." The road stretched out before them, dark and quiet. Gabriel wasn't sure why he felt responsible for her, but something about Francesca sitting beside him, looking out of place yet completely composed, made it impossible to just leave her to fend for herself. Half an hour later, neon lights flickered on the horizon. The diner was the kind of place that never closed, the parking lot half full despite the late hour. Gabriel pulled into a spot near the entrance and killed the engine. Inside, the warm scent of coffee and fried food wrapped around them. A waitress in a faded uniform gave them a nod as they slid into a booth near the window. Gabriel ordered coffee black. Francesca asked for the same, though he doubted she was used to diner-grade caffeine. "So," he said, leaning back against the worn vinyl seat. "What exactly does a billionaire CEO do when they're on the run?" Francesca stirred her coffee slowly, her gaze fixed on the swirling liquid. "They try to disappear. That working out for you?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Not particularly." Gabriel didn't push. If she wanted to tell him, she would. Instead, he took a sip of his coffee, wincing slightly at the bitterness. Across from him, Francesca did the same, her nose wrinkling just a little before she set the cup down. "Not your usual espresso," he teased. She exhaled, something close to amusement flickering in her eyes. "Not exactly." The waitress returned with a plate of fries, setting them down between them. Gabriel hadn't ordered them, but he wasn't about to complain. He grabbed one, dipping it into the small metal cup of ketchup. Francesca hesitated, then reached for one herself. For a while, they sat in a quiet rhythm, small bites of food, sips of coffee, the occasional glance out the window. Gabriel wasn't sure what to make of her. She was polished, refined, but there was something frayed at the edges, something raw. "What about you?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. He raised an eyebrow. "What about me? You said you have a daughter," Gabriel nodded. "Lily." Francesca rested her chin on her hand. "What's she like?" That was a question he could answer easily. "Smart, stubborn. Thinks she knows everything already." He smiled slightly. She's got this laugh loud and wild, like she doesn't care who hears it. Drives me crazy sometimes, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. Francesca's expression softened. She sounds incredible. She is. A strange quiet settled between them. Gabriel didn't know why he was telling her this. Maybe it was because she didn't look at him with pity, didn't make him feel like a struggling single dad stuck in an impossible cycle. Francesca traced the rim of her coffee cup. Why did you pick me up? Gabriel thought about that for a moment. Didn't feel right leaving you there. She studied him like she was trying to figure him out. Finally, she nodded. Thank you, she said. Gabriel wasn't sure what to say to that. So he just nodded back, letting the moment settle. Outside, the night stretched on, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. Gabriel hadn't planned on staying long at the diner, but as he watched Francesca push a fry around her plate, something in him hesitated. She wasn't just escaping something, she was lost, untethered in a way he recognized. He knew what it felt like to have the world slip from under you, to keep moving because stopping meant facing everything you were running from. The coffee had gone cold between them, and the hum of conversation from the other late-night patrons filled the space. Gabriel glanced at the clock on the wall. It was getting late. Lily was with his neighbor for the night, but he still had to be up early for work. You got somewhere to stay? He asked finally. Francesca set her cup down. Not yet. He exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't the kind of man who brought strangers into his life, especially not ones wrapped in mystery, but something about Francesca made it impossible to just walk away. Maybe it was the way she didn't ask for help, even when she clearly needed it. There's an inn down the road, he said. Not fancy, but it's clean. Francesca considered him for a moment, then nodded. That'll do. Gabriel signaled for the check and pulled out what little cash he had left. Francesca didn't reach for her wallet, which surprised him. He expected her to insist on paying, but she just watched him with quiet understanding, as if she knew better than to argue. They stepped outside, the night air crisp against his skin. The truck groaned as he started it again, and the drive to the inn was short, the neon vacancy sign flickering against the darkness. Gabriel pulled into the lot, shifting the truck into park. This is it. Francesca hesitated before reaching for the door handle. Thank you, she said, quieter this time. He nodded, gripping the wheel tighter. Take care of yourself, Francesca. She gave him one last look before stepping out, the flannel jacket still draped over her shoulders. Gabriel watched as she disappeared into the lobby, a strange tightness settling in his chest. He told himself this was the right thing to do, keep his distance, let her figure out her own way. But as he drove off, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Gabriel barely had time to process the strange night before the next morning hit him like a freight train. He was up before dawn, fixing Lily's breakfast while she chattered about her school project. It was a routine he was used to, but his mind kept drifting to Francesca, where she was, what she was doing. He shook the thought away. She wasn't his problem. By the time he got to work at the construction site, the sun had fully risen, and the familiar scent of sawdust and metal filled the air. Gabriel threw himself into the job, focusing on the measurements, the weight of the hammer in his hand, the sweat dripping down his back. Anything to keep his mind from wandering. But then, during his lunch break, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He frowned, wiping his hands on his jeans before answering. Yeah, you left before I could return your jacket. Gabriel froze, recognizing the voice instantly. Francesca. There was a slight pause before she spoke again. I'd like to see you. Gabriel glanced around, as if the conversation was something tangible that people could overhear. Why? A soft sigh came through the line. I don't know. That was an answer he understood too well. He exhaled, rubbing his forehead. I get off at 5. I'll be there. The line went dead. Gabriel stared at his phone for a long moment before slipping it back into his pocket. What the hell was he getting himself into? By the time he pulled into the parking lot of the diner after work, Francesca was already there, leaning against a sleek black car that looked completely out of place among the rusted trucks and sedans. She had changed her coat, replaced with a tailored jacket, her hair pinned back, but there was something guarded in her expression, as if she wasn't sure where she belonged. Gabriel stepped out of his truck, locking eyes with her. "That yours?" He gestured to the car. She nodded. "Had it delivered? You go back to your old life." Francesca exhaled, crossing her arms. "Not exactly." Gabriel waited, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she reached into the car and pulled out his flannel jacket, holding it out to him. "I figured you'd want this back." He took it, the fabric still carrying the faintest trace of her perfume. "Appreciate it." She shifted, glancing toward the diner. "Can I buy you dinner?" Gabriel hesitated. He should say no, he should walk away, but the truth was he didn't want to. "All right," he said finally. Inside, they slid into the same booth as before, the familiarity of it unsettling in a way Gabriel couldn't quite place. The waitress came over, and this time, Francesca ordered without hesitation a burger, fries, and a milkshake. Gabriel raised an eyebrow. "What?" she asked. "Didn't peg you for a burger and milkshake type." Her lips curved slightly. "Maybe I'm full of surprises." Gabriel leaned back. "Yeah. I'm starting to see that." The food arrived, and for a while they ate in silence, but there was something different now. The space between them wasn't just filled with questions, it was filled with understanding. Francesca wiped her hands on her napkin. "I left my company." Gabriel frowned. "What do you mean?" I stepped down, walked away. He studied her carefully. "Why?" She hesitated, then met his gaze. "Because I forgot what it felt like to live." Gabriel wasn't sure what to say to that. She exhaled, staring down at the table. "I built something massive, something powerful. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being a person and became an empire." She looked up at him. "Have you ever felt like you were drowning in something you created?" Gabriel tightened his grip on his coffee cup. "Yeah," she nodded, as if she already knew his answer. They sat there, two people from completely different worlds, yet somehow speaking the same language. And for the first time, Gabriel wasn't so sure they were strangers anymore. Gabriel wasn't sure when the shift happened, when Francesca stopped being a stranger in his truck and became something more. Maybe it was the way she listened when he talked about Lily, or how she never looked at him with pity when he spoke about struggling to make ends meet. Maybe it was the way she seemed to breathe easier around him, as if she could finally let go of the weight she carried. All he knew was that she wasn't just passing through his life anymore. She was staying. Days passed, and Francesca didn't leave town. She rented a small place on the edge of town, nothing like the penthouses or estates he imagined she once lived in. But she never complained. She slipped into his world like she belonged there, showing up at the diner, stopping by his job site with coffee, even helping Lily with her school projects when she visited. It was dangerous how easily she fit, how quickly she became a part of the life he had built, the life he had fought so hard to keep steady. One evening, after he put Lily to bed, Gabriel found Francesca sitting on his porch, watching the sky. She had started coming by in the evenings, always with an excuse, returning something Lily left in her car, bringing by fresh bread from the bakery, asking about local places to visit. But he knew better. She wasn't here for errands, she was here for him. He leaned against the wooden post, crossing his arms. "You planning on staying out here all night?" Francesca glanced at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "I like the quiet." Gabriel stepped closer, lowering himself onto the porch beside her. "You didn't have a lot of that before, did you?" She shook her head. "Not the kind that felt peaceful." They sat in silence for a moment, the warm evening air settling around them. Then, without thinking, Gabriel reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. Francesca stilled, her breath hitching just slightly. He hadn't meant to touch her, it had been instinct, natural, like he had done it 1,000 times before. Her gaze locked onto his, something unspoken hanging between them. "I should go," she whispered. Gabriel didn't move. "Do you want to?" Francesca swallowed, her fingers curling slightly against the porch wood. No, and that was all it took. He closed the space between them, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was slow, deliberate. She tasted like warm nights and unspoken promises, like something he hadn't let himself want in a long time. When they pulled apart, Francesca exhaled shakily, her forehead resting against his. "This is dangerous," she murmured. Gabriel traced his thumb along her jaw. "Yeah." She pulled back slightly, searching his face. "You don't ask for anything," he frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've had people in my life who only saw what I could give them. Money, power, a name that opened doors." Her voice softened. "You don't ask for anything." Gabriel held her gaze. "Maybe that's because I don't need anything from you." Francesca studied him for a long moment, then shook her head, almost in disbelief. "You don't even realize, do you?" "What?" "You're the first person in a long time who sees me not what I have." Gabriel's chest tightened. He hadn't thought about it like that, but now that she said it, he understood. She had spent years being wanted for what she could provide, not for who she was. "I see you, Francesca," he said, his voice steady, "and I don't care about your money." Something in her eyes flickered, something raw, vulnerable. And then she kissed him again, this time with more certainty, more need. Gabriel pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, letting himself sink into her completely. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about different worlds colliding. It was about this, about them. And for the first time in a long time, Gabriel wasn't afraid to want something for himself. Weeks passed, and Francesca's presence in Gabriel's life became as natural as breathing. She helped him fix the broken fence in his backyard, danced with Lily in the kitchen while dinner cooked, sat with him on the porch long after the stars had come out. But with every perfect moment, there was an underlying tension, because Francesca was still Francesca De Luca. And no matter how much she tried to blend into his world, her past hadn't disappeared. Gabriel found out the hard way when he walked into the diner one afternoon and saw a man in a suit sitting across from her, his expression sharp and calculating. Francesca's face was unreadable, but Gabriel could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled slightly against the table. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the diner, sliding into the booth beside her without a word. The man raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" Gabriel met his gaze evenly. "Who's asking?" Francesca exhaled. "Gabriel, this is Vincent. He works for my father." Gabriel's jaw tightened. He knew Francesca had left something behind, but he hadn't pushed. Now it was pushing back. Vincent leaned back in his seat, adjusting his cufflinks. "You've been difficult to find, Francesca." "I wasn't hiding," she said smoothly. "I left." Vincent's expression didn't change. "Your father wants you back." Francesca stiffened. "I don't care what he wants." Gabriel glanced at her, then back at Vincent. "She's not going anywhere." Vincent studied him, then smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I see." He stood, smoothing his suit jacket. "Let's hope that remains true." And with that, he walked out, leaving a chill in his wake. Gabriel turned to Francesca. "You want to tell me what that was about?" she exhaled, rubbing her temples. "My father doesn't like when things don't go his way." Gabriel had a feeling that was an understatement. Francesca met his gaze, something pleading in her expression. "I don't want to go back to that life, Gabriel." He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Then you won't." She searched his face. "Just like that. Just like that. Because he wasn't letting her go, not now, not ever." Gabriel knew trouble when he saw it, and Vincent had been the embodiment of it. The smooth arrogance, the subtle warning in his gaze, he had no doubt Francesca's father wasn't the type to accept her absence quietly. It wasn't just about a father wanting his daughter back. It was about control, about power. For the first time since she had entered his life, Gabriel felt the weight of the world Francesca had left behind pressing at the edges of theirs. That night, after settling Lily into bed, he found Francesca on his porch again, her posture unusually rigid, her fingers gripping the railing as if bracing herself against something unseen. Gabriel leaned against the doorway, watching her. You expecting him to show up again? Francesca didn't turn, but he caught the tension in her jaw. No, but that doesn't mean he won't. He stepped closer, resting a hand on the railing beside her. You think your father's going to force you back? She let out a quiet breath, her voice softer now. He doesn't believe in losing. And I walked away from everything he spent years building. Gabriel absorbed that. He had never met the man, but he understood the type. Someone who saw people as assets, as extensions of their empire, rather than individuals with their own choices. Francesca finally turned to him, searching his face. I don't want to bring this into your life, Gabriel. I should have, he cut her off before she could finish. Don't. She blinked, caught off guard. You don't get to decide that for me, he continued. I'm in this, Francesca. You don't scare me off that easy. Something flickered in her expression, relief, maybe, or something deeper. Gabriel reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers without hesitation. We'll figure this out. Francesca squeezed his hand in return, and for the first time that night, some of the tension in her shoulders melted away. The days that followed weren't easy. Francesca didn't hear from Vincent again, but that didn't mean she wasn't watching over her shoulder. Gabriel noticed the way she scanned a room when they entered, how she tensed at unfamiliar cars parked too long around town. Still, she didn't run. Instead, she stayed. She helped Lily with her homework, leaned against the kitchen counter while Gabriel cooked, sat beside him on late-night drives when he needed to clear his head. Gabriel wasn't one for fairy tales. He had spent too many years scraping by, too many sleepless nights worrying about whether he could give Lily the life she deserved. But Francesca made him want to believe in something more. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the trees, Francesca stood beside him in his small backyard, watching Lily chase fireflies. She glanced at him, her voice quieter than usual. I never thought this kind of life would be possible for me. Gabriel turned to her, studying the way the fading sunlight softened her features. What kind of life? She hesitated, then gestured toward Lily, toward the worn-down fence, toward everything that had become familiar. One that feels real. Gabriel exhaled slowly. It is real. Francesca's eyes met his, something unspoken passing between them. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he closed the space between them, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that felt like a promise. She melted into him, her fingers gripping the front of his shirt as if anchoring herself. When they finally pulled apart, Francesca let out a breathless laugh. You really don't know what you're getting into, do you? Gabriel smirked slightly. I know enough, and he did. He knew that whatever came next, whatever her past tried to drag her back into, he wasn't letting her go. Not now, not ever. The confrontation Gabriel had been expecting came not from Vincent, but from a different arrival, one that caught him off guard. It happened on a quiet afternoon when he was fixing the loose step on his porch. The sound of an expensive car pulling up made him glance up, his instincts already on edge. A man stepped out, older, refined, with the same sharp features as Francesca. Gabriel didn't need an introduction to know who he was, Francesca's father. The man approached with measured steps, dressed in a suit that didn't belong in a place like this. He stopped at the base of the porch, his gaze assessing, calculating. Gabriel stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. Something I can do for you. The older man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Gabriel, then let his gaze drift toward the house. My daughter is inside, isn't she? Gabriel didn't blink. She is, a pause. Then, I assume you know who I am. Gabriel folded his arms. I do. Francesca's father exhaled as if disappointed. She doesn't belong here. Gabriel met his gaze evenly. That's not your decision to make. Something cold flickered in the older man's expression. You think you can give her the life she's meant for? Gabriel didn't hesitate. I think she should decide what life she wants. A muscle in the older man's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the door behind Gabriel opened. Francesca stepped out, her expression unreadable. Father, she said, her voice steady. Her father turned to her. Francesca, you've had your fun. It's time to come home. She crossed her arms. I am home. A flicker of something frustration maybe crossed his face. You're making a mistake. Francesca didn't waver. No, I made a choice. Gabriel watched as she stepped closer, her voice unwavering. I spent my whole life living the way you wanted, being the daughter you expected, but I'm done being an extension of your legacy. I want something real. Her father's gaze darkened, and him. He gestured toward Gabriel. You think he's your future? Francesca didn't hesitate. Yes. Gabriel's chest tightened, warmth spreading through him at the certainty in her voice. Her father exhaled sharply, clearly displeased. You're throwing everything away. Francesca lifted her chin. No, I'm finally choosing something for myself. The older man stared at her for a long moment, then turned to Gabriel. I don't expect you to understand what she's walking away from. Gabriel met his gaze without flinching. I don't care what she's walking away from. I care about where she's going. A tense silence followed. Then, finally, Francesca's father let out a breath, something resigned in his expression. If this is your decision, he said, looking at Francesca, don't expect me to come chasing after you again. Francesca's fingers laced through Gabriel's. I wasn't expecting you to. Without another word, her father turned and walked back to his car, the engine roaring to life before he disappeared down the road. Gabriel glanced at Francesca. You okay? She exhaled, squeezing his hand. I am now. And as she leaned into him, Gabriel realized something she hadn't just found a place here. She had found home, and so had he. The sun dipped low behind the horizon, casting a golden glow over Gabriel's backyard. The air smelled like freshly cut grass and the lingering scent of the dinner they had just finished. Lily was inside, humming to herself as she colored at the kitchen table, but out here on the porch, it was just him and Francesca. She leaned against the wooden railing, her gaze lost in the sky, though Gabriel knew her mind was somewhere else. He stepped closer, reaching out to tuck a strand of her hair behind her ear, his touch lingering for just a second longer than necessary. You're quiet, he said. Francesca turned to him, a small smile playing at the edges of her lips. Just thinking. Gabriel tilted his head slightly. About, she hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. Then finally, she exhaled. For the first time in my life, I don't have a plan. Gabriel considered that. Francesca had spent years running an empire, making decisions that affected thousands of people. She had been molded into someone who always had the answers, always knew the next step. But now she was standing here in his world, untethered from the life she had left behind. He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. That scare you? Francesca glanced down at their joined hands, then back up at him. Less than I thought it would. Gabriel studied her, the way her shoulders had relaxed, the way her breathing was even and steady. She wasn't the same woman who had stepped into his truck that night. She had changed, or maybe she had finally allowed herself to be who she was meant to be. Maybe you don't need a plan, he said. Maybe you just need to live. Francesca let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. You make it sound so easy. Gabriel tugged her closer, wrapping his arms around her waist. Not easy. Worth it. She rested her forehead against his, her breath warm against his skin. What if I don't know how to do this? Gabriel brushed his thumb along her cheek. Then we figure it out together. Francesca closed her eyes for a moment, as if letting the words sink in. Then, when she opened them again, there was something different there, something certain. I love you, she said, her voice steady. Gabriel felt his chest tighten, the weight of her words settling deep inside him. He had known it, had felt it in every stolen glance, in every touch that lingered just a second too long. But hearing it, that was something else entirely. He cupped the back of her neck, pulling her into a slow, deliberate kiss. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his heart pounding. I love you too, he murmured. Francesca smiled against his lips, and for the first time there was no hesitation, no doubt. It was real. It was theirs. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. Francesca officially severed ties with her father's company, choosing to build something new, something entirely her own. She stayed in town, finding a rhythm in a life that was quieter but far more fulfilling. She spent her mornings helping at a local community center, using her business knowledge to support struggling small businesses. Afternoons were filled with trips to the park with Lily, lazy lunches at the diner, and long walks with Gabriel when the sun began to set. But it was the nights that Gabriel loved most. The quiet moments when Francesca curled against him on the couch, her breathing even, her presence so natural it was as if she had always belonged there. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Gabriel reached into his pocket, his fingers curling around the small box hidden there. His pulse quickened, but when he looked at Francesca, he knew. He knew there was no doubt. Taking a steady breath, he turned to her. Francesca. She looked up at him, her eyes warm, filled with something soft and unguarded. Gabriel stood, pulling her gently to her feet. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the small velvet box and flipping it open. Francesca's breath hitched. Inside, nestled in the soft fabric, was a ring. It wasn't flashy, wasn't the kind of thing she had probably been presented with before, but it was real, it was meaningful. Gabriel took her hand, his voice steady. I don't have a big speech, I don't have a grand plan, but I know that I want you, every day. For the rest of my life. Francesca's eyes shimmered, her lips parting slightly as she exhaled. Gabriel held her gaze. Marry me. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then slowly, a smile spread across her lips and she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Gabriel slipped the ring onto her finger, and the moment it settled there, Francesca threw her arms around him, kissing him deeply, as if sealing the promise between them. And just like that, everything was exactly as it was meant to be. The wedding was small, intimate. Gabriel had never imagined himself in a tux, standing in front of family and friends. But as he watched Francesca walk toward him, dressed in soft ivory, her eyes locked on his, he knew there was no place he would rather be. Lily stood between them, holding both their hands as they exchanged vows, her grin wide and unrestrained. When Gabriel kissed Francesca, when the cheers of their loved ones surrounded them, he knew this was the life he had fought for. A life filled with love, with family, with Francesca. As they danced under the twinkling lights strung across the backyard, Francesca rested her head against his chest, her hand curled around his. You still don't ask for anything, she murmured. Gabriel pressed a kiss to her temple. That's because I already have everything I need. And as they swayed together, surrounded by laughter and warmth, Gabriel knew this wasn't just the ending of one story. It was the beginning of something even greater, a life built not on wealth or power but on love, and that was worth everything.